Okay, great. So my name is Michele Lancione, and I am the co-director of the Beyond Inhabitation Lab at the University Polytechnic of Turin. The other director is Abdulmalik Simon. The Beyond Inhabitation Lab is a lab that comprises a number of people based in Turin who are working on several projects, Urban Studies Foundation projects, Marie Curie's, BRCs, all connected by this focus around issues of housing precarity, and the political economy of housing around the globe. But the Beyond Inhabitation Lab also comprises a very nice steering committee with a number of powerful scholars situated in different parts of the world. And today we have the great pleasure of having one of the steering committee members here with us, Cristina Cielo. So thank you for joining us all the way from Quito. And I'm just going to introduce Cristina, and then we will leave her 45 minutes, 50 minutes to speak about her paper today. So Cristina today is presenting a paper entitled Cultivation, Reproduction, and Disputes for Diverse Commons. Cristina is a professor researcher in the Department of Sociology and Gender Studies of the Latin American Faculty of Social Sciences in Quito, Ecuador. She studies the subjective and political dimension of economic inequality produced by the violence of contemporary forms of work, property, and authority. She has explored these issues through research and teaching in Ecuador and Bolivia, the Philippines, California, and South Africa. Through collaborative and comparative methodology, she seeks to contribute to the relational analysis of our multi-scale belongings in the global economy, in national territories, and in our common and vital forms of care. So it really is a great pleasure for me to have Cristina here. And I'm just going to hand it over to her to share the screen, and hopefully the technology will work, and we will enjoy your talk.
Thank you so much.
Okay, perfect.
We're good?
Yes, we are.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, Michele, for having me. Thank you, all of you, for being here. And really for the opportunity to think through some ideas. I was commenting to Michele how luxurious it is to have a 45-minute captive audience. Some of you might leave, but I would see you. And it's really nice because it gives me an opportunity to think through and to connect different research projects and different concepts which I've worked on separate in separate moments. And so what I'm going to present today is an attempt. It's my very first attempt. It's going to happen right here in front of you to connect notions which I've worked on. These, I'll mention them later on, the diverse commons, extended reproduction, the idea of affective ecologies, and cultivation and food. I worked on these different projects over year-long projects. And my challenge is, how do I use it? How do I leverage these ideas that have taken place in research projects in many different places? How do I leverage the ideas to think about what's happening today in Ecuador, in particular, in Latin America more generally, and then maybe we can have some exchange and you guys can tell me what's happening here or where you're working on and how these ideas might or might not help us think through them. So this photograph, which I downloaded on the World Wide Web, from the World Wide Web, is a photograph which I particularly liked because this is in the Nigerian Delta. It's a photo from the New York Times, a photographer from the New York Times. And this child is cooking yuca or cassava over the heat from a pipeline. So we have sort of the extractivism and food. How do we think together about sort of the coexistence of sustenance, what we need to reproduce ourselves, and the violences that come with the structuring of our economies. And the question really that I thought that we could think through together was this one: how are disparate and unequal contexts, from the households to the market, from agroforestry to urban spaces. So we have all these different contexts, but somehow they're assembled together in a way which at times reproduce inequalities, violent inequalities, and at other times give us possibilities, some sort of openings to challenge these. So how do we think about them together? And what I've been working on food. I've been working on cassava. Cassava is fascinating. And I'll talk a little bit about more later, but I look around me in Ecuador and it's actually it has a lot to do with the peace process in Colombia, which Ecuador borders Colombia. And the peace process actually created a fragmentation of paramilitary groups and the dollarized economy in Ecuador. Ecuador dollarized in 2000, along with the impacts of COVID. All of these have led to the spread of criminal activity. And not just the spread, I mean, this is like everywhere it's happening, where they're called vaccinations. In the kind of like most upper class neighborhoods, people have to pay in order to stay open. I'm sure you've heard of this, and it's called in other terms in other places. And most recently, a store in somewhere right nearby where I live, they were like, no, I'm not going to pay this. It's kind of a new thing in the city of Quito. It's been the case on the Ecuadorian coast over the last few years, and I'll talk a little bit about the Ecuadorian coast in a little bit. And they said, no, we won't pay them. So they came in with some guns and like killed 13 people. And this is becoming, unfortunately, more and more common. Ecuador always has been a place for money laundering because of the dollarized economy, because of its nearness to routes, drug trafficking routes. The picture on the left side is car bombings have been happening, especially in the city of Guayaquil. And you can see the incredibly sharp rise in homicides over the last 2 or 3 years. So what does cassava and manioc have to do with this violence? I feel like I really need to, on one hand, feel useful, feel like my research is actually helping us explain the world we live in. But I also think that there's some connections that will open up possibilities for understanding things in other places. So the explanations given for the rise in violence are some of them that I mentioned: the dollarized economy, the peace process in Colombia, but also that in Latin America lost over 26 million jobs in 2020 with the pandemic. It was the region of the world that lost the highest percentage of jobs. These have slowly been, I mean, people have to work in some things. These have slowly been recuperating, but mostly in informal markets. So one of the explanations for the rise of violence is poverty and inequalities. People have nowhere else to turn to, so they turn to the narco economy. We have people I've interviewed in the coastal city of Esmeraldas who are fishermen who make $15 a week, a week, can be paid $4,000 to take a trip with drugs on their boat to a boat further off. So that's one of the explanations for the rise of, for the insertion of a criminal activity, of narco economy, of criminal groups in all sorts of spheres in Ecuador. Another one is public policies that have hollowed out inclusionary policies. If you look at our previous, from 2012, there was actually a drop in homicide rates from 2012 to 2017, which have to do with an increase in public service, public investments rather, and also in jobs. So these two explanations for me they're valid. They do have their truth, but these structural reasons finally don't account for those elements of the way we organize ourselves that have to do with the collective and effective confirmation of our social and material worlds, and also with the very diverse practices, with the ways our daily inventions, our everyday inventions to make it, as maybe Malik would say. So how do we think then about other reasons for the rise of violence in Ecuador and how we connect these to these different ideas, which I propose to think about together. So this is another way to put the question I started out with. And as I mentioned before, I'm going to work through there's 4 different entry points of thinking about the commons and the diversity of commons, thinking about extended reproduction and effective ecologies, thinking about cultivation and food and its relationship, especially to extractivism, and then we'll try to put it all together and think about how we can understand contemporary economic organization and the crises that we're living through the concepts and research projects. So we all know the literature on the commons. We all know the radical hopes we have for the commons, that they're no longer tragic, but really they're a revolutionary way of taking on capitalism. And we all also know that they've been that because of the way they attempt to dispute the expropriation of socially produced wealth. This is a book by Dardot and Laval, which many of you probably know. So there's been this literature on the commons, which is hopeful. And a lot of the ideas that I work with and work through are hopeful. Reproduction, the commons, community. These are all good things which we would hope would help us pave a path through kind of the ruins of capitalism, as Anat Singh might say. And yet, we haven't done it. We're still here talking about how bad things are. And so one idea that has helped me think about commons and how and why commons both help us think about sort of the economic inequalities we live in, as well as aren't an answer in the end that will help us sort of revolutionize capitalism, is because they're diverse. When we talk about the commons, there's this idea that there's the commons and it's the people reappropriating our own work, which can face up to the expropriation of work by the accumulation of labor, of capital. But what I found so this first part of the talk is based on work I did some years back in Bolivia. And what I wanted to understand was the way that neighborhoods constitute commons, particularly the neighborhoods which were being celebrated by the global left as the neighborhoods reclaiming the common good of water. So you may have heard, you probably all know that in 2000, the water war in Bolivia basically sought to challenge the privatization of water, the concession of water by the municipal government to Bechtel. And Aguas del Tunari was the local national instantiation of Bechtel. And the, autogestionado, it's called in Spanish, the self-management of housing, of water, of property, of territory, are all celebrated kind of in the global left. And I was really interested in trying to understand how that works on a practical level. And what I found was that there's a whole lot of ways and we all know this, but now I have evidence. There are a whole lot of different ways that commons are constituted, that collectives are managed. And what they mean is not only the organization of resources, but they also mean specific kinds of exclusions and inequalities. So I ended up using ideotypes, being a sociologist, and I found a couple of different, I kind of grouped practical constitutions of the common into 3 different ideotypes. And one of these was what I call the neoliberal neighborhoods, and they were the bad ones, but they were the ones which were most celebrated internationally, they were the ones that got the most international funding to create water tanks, like the one that you see on the side, because they had leadership that was professional, that was representative, the participation was representative. However, the leaders weren't necessarily like everybody else in the neighborhoods. The neighborhoods I worked in were peripheral urban neighborhoods, which were the housing was autogestionado, was created on, they built on their own. They were informal neighborhoods. They were informal neighborhoods. When people moved in, there was no water, there was no electricity. We all know these neighborhoods. And the question is, how do peripheral urban neighborhoods become part of a city? And so what I found was that one path to do that was to efficiently manage resources, to have representative professional leaders and to elect them because they were the architects, not because they looked like everybody else or talked like everybody else, but because they would know how to talk to the municipal leaders. And this neighborhood did really well. They got Italian money. They got Italian money to build this water tank and to have it filled by water trucks that came in and filled. So they were one of the first neighborhoods in the area. I studied in the area far away from the city center. They were one of the first neighborhoods to have a water system. Now, what was that water system like? That water system necessarily needed some, in order to be part of the water system, you had to pay into it. And so you had to pay in equivalent of about $100, which there was a lot of money. And so what you ended up having was very unequal access to water. You had migrants who had families who lived in the neighborhood who were able to pay in. When I was there was 30 to 35% of the people were connected to the water system. The rest of them weren't. Another neighborhood, another ideal type was what I call the counter-hegemonic neighborhood. And the leaders, the mining tradition, syndicate mining tradition in Bolivia is one of the most politically powerful movements. Evo Morales, you probably heard his name. Evo Morales came to power as a miner, as the president of the largest mining federation. And this neighborhood, it was called actually San Juan Mineros because a lot of the people who first inhabited the area were miners. And this neighborhood, so in this previous neighborhood, I spent a lot of time in these neighborhoods, and this neighborhood would have their meetings late at night with the dirigentes, the leaders, community leaders, and about 8-10 people would show up late at night after everybody came back from work. This neighborhood on Sundays, they would shoot not cannons, but they would shoot fireworks in the air on Sundays, and everybody would slowly come. You would have like 400 people gathered in a large hollow area. And it was an area where the participation was incorporative. It involved the people. It was, I call it collaborative, but in Spanish it's incorporado, it's bodily. And the leaders were these incredibly charismatic leaders. And the way that they built their water system was, as you see on the left side, everybody worked to build the water system. They had some connections with NGOs. The NGOs helped with the training, but the way it happened was that everybody built the water system. This created a very different dynamic. Both of these are self-managed. Both of these neighborhoods are self-built by the communities. Both of them are community neighborhoods, but the inequalities, who got to say what, who got to be part of the community decisions were very different. In this case, it was the professionals, and there was an unequal participation and unequal access to resources. And in this case, it was a very collaborative participation, which is kind of what we want. But at the same time, the need to have a unified counter-hegemony also created outside groups. So when there was problems in the neighborhood, for example, it was very clear that it was the young children of migrants who were to fault. In that neighborhood, I remember one of the first assemblies I was in, the community leader yelled out, "Viva Minero San Juan," and everybody yelled out, "Viva!" And then he yelled out, que mueran los Yankees. And I'm a little Yankee there, like, oh, hope they don't find me. But there was a very clear enemy. There were always very clear enemies. And then this third ideal type of neighborhood is one, it's a neighborhood that could never get anything done. This neighborhood was made up mostly of migrants from rural areas, and their meetings were at 5 in the morning in somebody's home. They were these tiny, has to do also with the histories of how the areas were settled, but the organization was very interpersonal. They were much smaller. There were delegates who were sent to a kind of board to make decisions, but the small meetings allowed for, here I call it shared preoccupations. It allowed for the private and the public not to be so separate. It did matter what was happening to somebody's son. It did matter that somebody didn't show up. Where could they be? Are they okay? Water, they had no access to water. The trucks didn't even like to go up there because it was way up on a hill. They didn't have that much, but they did share it. So you have these different, so they were excluded from the city because their actually representation worked on a, as it does in many rural neighborhoods, rural communities, it worked on a rotational basis. So somebody would always be the leaders who was just like the rest of us. And so I was very interested in these specific exclusions and inequalities of very diverse ways of constituting commons. So what this is in Spanish, it's a graph in Spanish, but the dark columns represent the personal interaction, the small groups. And these are, on the one side, on the very right is women, those with less education, and youth. And we did surveys to see how much people participated in their organizations. And the people who had vulnerable groups that participated the most, the dark bars are the ones with small, with the meetings of small people, of small groups. The middle gray bar is the one, the counter-hegemonic neighborhood, and the low bars are the representative neighborhood. So, and on the left, you can see what it says. In a lot of places in all of Latin America, you'll see dummies held up, and it says, if we find anybody who's doing anything criminal, we will burn you, or we will take care of you. And there's a community social justice, because the law does not reach there, and community social control, they call it. And this is in the neighborhood of the counter-hegemonic. So each form of constituent commons allows for different abilities to access from the community and also different exclusions. So that's one nut that I'm going to put on the table. I'm going to put a couple of kind of nuts on the table, and then we're going to try to see what we can do with them. The second one is from a different research project. The second one is an idea that the colleagues and I have been working with in Ecuador and in Latin America, called extended reproduction. So we know the research, the literature, the theories on the importance of thinking reproductive work, the ways that reproductive work is part of the possibility of productive work. The Italian feminists who say the salary hides more work, or the salary controls more work than it lets on. So the question is, I started a research project looking at areas where the petroleum sector has entered in the Amazon region, and also looking at other areas. We looked at the petroleum circuit, one area of exploitation, one area of exploration, and one area of processing of petroleum. And what helped me understand the dynamics in each of these are theories of affective ecologies. Neera Singh was very helpful in I think I was at an AEG once with her, on a panel with her. And so the question of reproduction, I think one thing that looking at indigenous areas helps us do, and indigenous forms of reproduction, is it helps us go beyond the idea of social reproduction. So if on the one hand, feminist economists challenge the escission of reproductive and productive work, people like Jason Moore theoretically, but people on the ground in the Amazon can't think of reproductive work apart from thinking of their relationship with animals, their relationship with plants, their relationship with spirits. So the idea of affective ecologies, so Simone Bignal talks about the complex selves, and the idea that we are constituted by the heterogeneous diversity and the articulation of these differences. And so this idea of complex selves is one of the reasons that in the news you see so powerfully you see so powerfully Amazonian women defending their territories from oil exploitation, is partly because they don't think of it really as their territories. They think of it as part of what I'm calling, Simone Bignal calls, complex selves. And so now I'm studying yucca, cassava, which originated in the Amazon. And to understand the role of cassava in the Amazon is to try to understand, first of all, agroforestry practices, which don't separate agricultural from sort of natural production. It's understanding the spirits and the powers that are necessary for the production or the cultivation of yucca. And these complex selves are put into even starker relief when you have something like, when you have the transformation of Amazonian communities. So in the period of the, it's called the Citizen Revolution, it's the period of Rafael Correa. He was our pink-tied guy. And a lot changed. We were talking about how higher education changed. There were also a lot of changes in public investments in this case, in sites of oil exploitation. So what you have on the left side is a community called Playas de Cuyabeno. And it looks a lot like many other Amazonian regions in which people live away from the populated center and come into the populated center for the school, for the exchanges. On the left, you have it 20 years ago. And on the right, you have how it was transformed under the Correa government. So Correa began there was the dream of having 200 millennium cities. This one was the second one throughout the Amazon. It never happened because, of course, the oil dropped. And there were a lot of loans from China, which Ecuador pays back in oil. So, but the idea was to bring development to the Amazonian communities. This is a view from above. And there are these streets that you could easily drive a car on, except that there's no way to get a car there because it's on the river. And it takes 5 or 6 hours to get there from the nearest town or city. But there's a transformation. So the affective ecologies really helped me sort of understand how these are transformed when the structure in what the infrastructure within which one lives is transformed. So the women were no longer allowed to have animals around. There was some sort of, I mean, they were given this community on the one hand, but there were also rules that came with it. One of them was animals couldn't be there and they couldn't make fires because they had kitchens. And why would they need fires if they have kitchens now? And women would actually build areas underneath their houses. As you can see, there's areas underneath the houses. It's a very wet area. So there's areas underneath the houses to protect it from humidity. So they would enclose areas and secretly have chicks there. And they would build fires in order to warm up the chicks. And they would sometimes go into the forest and make their yucca and make their fish, grilled fish. And what was fascinating for me was to see the intergenerational change. So the children who we spoke to, there was a whole Millennium City school, I know a picture of it, but the children we spoke to were far more scared of the jungle. They liked to be in the city. The city was well lit, and they told me that there were fewer mosquitoes and there were fewer bad spirits. And so this whole idea of how do you constitute the collective? How do you constitute the complex self? How do you reproduce it? How do you sustain yourself? Transformed radically, as you well imagine. And women their work was literally domesticated. At that time, I was reading Silver Feather Each. I was like, this is happening here too. She was describing 14th and 15th century Europe. And I was, this is happening here too. Their work was domesticated. They became more dependent on men. They had to stay in the cities in order for their kids to go to the school. So caring and reproducing, what care meant, what taking care of your family meant, something completely different. And it meant market dependence. It meant a loss of, so women would tell me, for example, that women used to give birth using herbals, using the wisdom of other women, and now they went to the health center and they were scared. They didn't know where to place themselves. Were they modern, going to health centers, having babies, or were there, I mean, they knew about the herbs, but they kind of didn't know where to place themselves. And so in this case, reproduction became social, it became domesticated, it became human. Whereas, and that's what helped me to understand. I mean, I always compare my neighborhoods. I compared here. I compared different communities, and also when I'm looking at cassava, I'm also comparing the Amazon with the coast. And comparisons really help me to see what's happening in each place. And so, extended reproduction is the idea that our reproduction takes place with the material world, with the non-human world, and it's not just social reproduction that we need to understand. And affective ecologies, I mean, it's the ontological apuesta, bet theories, which say we're constituted along with, it's Spinoza's also his idea of affect. It's that we're constituted along with our acting upon others as they and we are constituted. Where does the self end? And it's this idea of the complex selves which brings women, particularly women in the last 15 years, to the fore of struggles to defend Amazonian territory. So that's the second nut I'm putting on the table. I have one more nut, and it's cassava. And it's cassava, which has been, this is from JSTOR. We all know JSTOR. They call it the root crop of the century. And cassava, actually, when I started this project, a friend of mine asked me if I knew the book called History of the Bastards, Corn and Capitalism. And I just ordered it, and I haven't read it yet. But I'm interested in cassava also because of its role in colonial and imperial trade. So cassava is first domesticated in the Amazon, and it goes from Brazil on slave ships because it stays fresh longer. It doesn't rot as quickly as wheat, cassava flour. And so it arrives to Africa, and from Africa goes back to the Caribbean. And the reason it's called the root crop of the century is because of its ability to grow in very arid, very diverse climates. The amount of energy it produces per hectare is far more than corn or wheat. And so there's hope, an idea that in this moment of climate change, that cassava is going to help feed the many people who need to be fed. And we can see, this is a painting, a drawing from the 17th century, where we can see cassava in the fresh West Indies. And on the right side, the blue line is the growth of the world production of cassava. And part of what's interesting to me is the very different role. So looking at the same product, really, the same food stuff in different places shows the way that its relational role in the constitution of these commons. And so the blue line, so there's been a surge in production of cassava, especially in Africa, where there's great hopes for it for development, and Southeast Asia, where it's mostly an export product. And so again, I'm comparing places because it helps me to think. And so the roles of cassava in the Amazon region have a lot to do with what I was mentioning earlier. There's a word, it's called a chakra, and it's not the like Indian like chakra that has to do with this, but it's a chakra. It's been translated as, it's not really a garden. The chakra is an agroforestry system in which the cultivation of products takes place along with the sort of natural forest of the jungle. So it's actually recently been certified by the FAO, the Food and Agricultural Organization of the UN, as a globally, let's see if I get this right, a globally important traditional agricultural system. And the chakra then in the Amazon is part of, it's a central piece of the chakra. The cassava is a central piece of women's chakras. And on the Ecuadorian coast, on the other hand, it's also very important on the Ecuadorian coast, but it's important in very different ways. It's important, the Ecuadorian coast has a history since colonization. The Ecuadorian coast and the province that I work in called Manabí is an area with valleys, with very arable land. And it's been the place, the wheat basket, as we would call it in the United States, for the production of much needed agriculture. And since then, with this history, it's also been land in Manabí has always been dominated, first by the colonists, then by the church, and then by the Republican elites. And so because of this history of land, the way that agriculture works on the Ecuadorian coast is clearly very different, and it works following the volatility of market needs. So banana, coffee, cocoa, now dragon fruit, all have their moments. Corn in one moment has been really important. And so yuca, it's called in Spanish yuca, cassava, has had this hope, also this developmental hope. And this is from a book in the 1980s, the National Institute, INEA, the National Institute for the Study of Agriculture, more or less, began to do many studies of cassava, also because the starch from cassava feeds shrimp. And shrimp is one of the, Ecuador is a highly primary commodity dependent nation, mostly oil, but also banana, shrimp, and the fourth one I think is cocoa now. And on the Ecuadorian coast, there have been the development of different, very variedades, different species of varieties of cassava in order to help development, in order to get Ecuadorian farmers, agriculturalists on the coast involved and developed. And so it has these very different roles in these two places. And this is something that that I'm interested in exploring. This is a current research project now. And so the question is how, that's the third node, cultivation and cassava. And so how do these ideas help us to better understand contemporary crises and, name your crisis? We're all talking about multiple crises now, health crises, economic crises, political crises. In Ecuador now, we're talking about all these crises. In fact, I was just on a panel just before coming, and the title of the panel was Understanding the Collapse. It's like, really, guys, really, that's the title you come up with? with, because it does. It really feels like it's falling apart. You can't go out onto the street. Literally, you can't go out on the street without the fear of something happening. And I'm talking about in the middle of the day. I had a student, I drive my students home because they can't afford to walk home. So it's like, you can't walk at night. So how do we take these notes? How do we take these ideas of diverse commons, of extended reproduction, affective ecologies, and sort of historically constituted roles for the same product? How do these help us to better understand contemporary crises? So sticking with cassava, cassava is I mentioned it earlier, it's, hold on one second, sorry. So it's being produced in the Southeast Asia for export mostly, but as we can see, its consumption is very high in Latin America. And in fact, there's a food paradox that people talk about in Latin America, because Latin America produces far more food than it needs to feed the population it has. And yet Ecuador in particular has a very high hunger and malnutrition rate. These are women on the coast producing yucca. And what is the relationship then to the developmental incorporation of certain agricultural systems, of certain agricultural products like cassava, and the fact that the coast of Ecuador is also now one of the most violent because of the drug trafficking? Let's see. Okay, yeah, so, sorry, I just lost my place. Okay, so cassava's role in food security. And if we think of food security, cassava has a very important role in food security in the Amazon, clearly. If we think of food security and what we mean by food security, we think of it necessarily being part of a non-extractive assemblage, as would be the case for any basic human need: water, health. As soon as food's economic or productive role is more decisive in what it does than its reproductive role, it moves social organization towards extractive relations. Even in these development projects that I mentioned on Ecuador's coast, on Ecuador's coast, even in the development projects, when they only attend to cassava's economic potentials, what it ends up doing is increasing market dependence of the agricultural workers. And we see it when I talk to the agricultural workers, they're constantly looking for the next sort of market opening. They're trying to decide whether to stop growing something and turn entirely towards, the newest one is pitihaya, dragon fruit. That's the newest one. Everybody's clearing their fields and beginning to plant dragon fruit. So what it does is it increases their market dependence and vulnerability, and supports the extractive logic of capitalist relations. And women's central role, and that's something I didn't mention that much, but is also what's interesting to me, is that women have a central role in the Amazon. It's only women. There's a power that women give to their daughters or to other women, to their granddaughters, which is the power to produce cassava. And it's only if you have the power that actually your cassava plant will be productive. So women's central role in cassava cultivation disappears with its incorporation into productive context. So when it's on the Ecuadorian coast, men and women equally cultivate cassava. And so it disappears in these development projects on the coast of Ecuador. But economic development projects are not the only productive projects on the Ecuadorian coast. I would argue that organized crime is also a productive project. Organized crime, because organized crime also seeks to profit from circuits of production, exchange, and distribution. And what happens, and the reason these are related to increasing violence, is that these production chains are violently disputed and they challenge state control of territories. So as I mentioned before, taking ideas from Silvia Federici, women's incorporation into capitalist relations in the 14th and 15th centuries depended on violence against the power of their specific knowledges, taken as witchcraft. Their incorporation into contemporary productive relations of narco-trafficking takes on much more performative violence against their bodies. So the same horrors of dismemberment that we've heard of in northern Mexico, that they've become infamous in northern Mexico, are now coming to Ecuador, where the crime rate, as I showed before, has had the sharpest rise globally. And the coastal cities in particular of Esmeraldas and Guayaquil have among the highest homicide rates in the world. So the rise in violence in Ecuador has been accompanied not only with a rise of violence against women, but also more specifically, a rise in violence, a rise in femicides that are related to organized crime. On the right side, you have 2021, and these are femicides related to organized crime in Ecuador. On the right side, you have 2021. On the left side, you have double that number of femicides in 2022. At the same time, racialized and marginalized women, along with men from the same popular sectors, are increasingly victims of new patterns of illegal capitalist accumulations as incarcerated populations. There's been a change in policies for prison populations, and micro-trafficking has become one of the reasons that more and more people are in jails. In the last 20 years, the prison population has risen 469% in Ecuador. And so the prisons in Ecuador now, what's happening is the prisons in Ecuador are actually a stark reflection of organized crime groups' control over this site, which is supposedly the epitome of state law. In just the last 2 years, there have been 8 massacres, 8 riots turned into massacres, with over 400 inmates killed. So how do we connect all this? It's not then the categories of devalued work of women or other marginalized groups, but rather it's not then only that there are these categories of devalued work, but the question is what do these categories do? So prison regimes literally set apart often racialized populations. And many people have shown, among them Louis Bacon, have shown that racial institutions from slavery to ghettos to contemporary carceral regimes sustain inequalities that allow for the exploitation of people and their work. So the racialization of populations allows for the people to subjectively feel the hierarchies which are naturalized in the society. And that allows their devaluated work to be poorly paid or not at all. This is the connection. I use Jason Moore here to connect the devaluation of categorized populations with the devaluations of nature. What he calls the cheap things that we need for capitalist accumulation to keep working. And one thing that's important to mention, and here's a link which I still need to work on more, but the multiple violences against marginal communities are thrown back onto them in terms of economic precarities and food insecurity. Over 90% of incarcerated women in Ecuador are mothers, and their situation, and also the situation of women who have been victims of gender violence, makes their families more vulnerable as well. So there was a study that looked at the impacts and costs. The VCM is violence against women in many different areas. And one thing that they looked at, and the highest cost for the families, they looked at children's health, they looked at scholarization, their progress through school, but the highest impact that violence against women has is on food security. So on the gray is a comparison of women who are not victims of violence, and the pink ones are women who are victims against violence. And what they're looking at is whether they've bought, the top one is whether they've bought food on credit, whether their children have been hungry, It's a difference between 5% and 12.5% for children and families of women victims of violence, whether they've been hungry and whether there hasn't been enough money to buy food. So the violence against women, the increasing violence, which creates more violence against women, and the carceral regime, which puts women, especially for over half, I think it's over 57% of women incarcerated is for micro trafficking, is for being involved in drug trade, creates more difficulties and throws back on them, as I mentioned, onto their families, onto these same populations, the same violences that they're living. And so the idea of, and here's another link I have to make in a sense more clearly, the idea of extraction of nature depends on the categorization, the differentiation of humans and non-humans, of certain types of populations and other types of populations. And it's not, our categories help us think. We need categories, but the question is what are these categories put to? And in what ways then, well, here's just kind of what I said, the devaluation of racialized prison population, women's bodies and their work, and the separation of our affective co-constitution with nature constitute the particular forms by which contemporary productive and extractive relations work, thinking of extraction as a contemporary logic of capitalism. And in the face of that, the question is, this is from, there is kind of regularly protests against government policies. This one was in 2019. And the question is then, faced with these deepening and extended extractive relations, what kind of commons, what kind of ways of organizing reproduction do we need to do what kinds of work? And that's a question we all have to answer. That's a question we need to keep working on together to get to try to figure out.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to stop the recording now. And yeah. Okay.